Shalom, shalom, family. As always, at the 10-minute mark, or some days we just start off, we're going to say the Lord's Prayer. So bow with me as we say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, honored be thy name. May thy kingdom come. May thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us on a righteous path, and guard us from the evil one. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen, amen. Shalom, shalom, family. So today I'm taking the whole day just focusing on questions and answers as we went over a lot of different things. And sometimes some things are heavier than others, and some things may seem complex, and some things to others may not seem right. So, given the opportunity to look into those things as if someone has more information on something, or if they feel like something needs more refining or more correction, now is that time to bring that out. So, with that, we're going to get right to something interesting that I think we should talk about. So, as we've been going over this deep information, the reason why is because as we approach the last day, we who have Christ have assurance already by faith. But we know that there are ancient things, right? We can't say blood doesn't exist, or stars don't exist, or the earth itself doesn't exist, right? There's been a lot of effects since this day, right? There's been the flood. There's been claims of 3 generations that came from a man named Noah. Noah's name means rest. He brought forth 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. I believe all these things are true. I believe all these things are evident. I do believe the narrative that the biblical narrative talks about when it talks about the world is only 6,000 years. I want to quickly talk about that before I talk about anything else. Let me just go to a note. We did a very deep video, my last video, and I just want to talk about that. The reason why is because, let me just get right to it. The reason why is because this is some very new, different information. It may shock some people by some of the years on it, but I added something to the description that I just want to go over real fast. Now, you probably noticed that sometimes when we're going over these things, you will see astronomical years. Now, we know that it makes perfect sense because if you have seen already, just in the last 2-3 years, the world's been going crazy over said global warming and things like that, and basically a lot of carbon emissions. Well, what's interesting about that, just notice how the world, just from a short time of our lifetime, the world slightly changed, quote unquote, slightly changed from some of the carbon emission that had happened throughout time. In fact, let me go to a note here. Actually, it's right on here. I'm gonna go down and grab it from one of these notes here, right here. And I was just talking about it, but I didn't point this part out. I'm gonna point it out real fast. Let me just grab it from this little note we went over right here. All right. See if I can make it a little darker. There we go. All right. So I'm just gonna jump to the bottom here to about our time. It's just some interesting information that they talk about in our time. I'm just gonna read some. So from 2020, 2022, and stuff like that. I'm just gonna read some things. It just talks about basically a lot of different things of the emissions and stuff. You can see. I'm just gonna look at let's say some of this one. Human and natural populations are reaching limits to climate adaptation. So it's very interesting that a lot of these things are talking about climate in our age, in our time frame. I'm gonna go up a little more. Just gonna read a few of them. You see right here, Britain generates more electricity from zero carbon sources than from fossil fuels for the first time. Just talk about basically even, because using electricity, it doesn't run on nothing. It runs on coal. So you're always burning, you're always using something to make energy, And then some other things, 2018, hottest ground surface temperature on Earth, 80.8 Celsius. You can see in Mexico and everything. Too hostile for plant life. And then you'll get it a lot in different places. You can see 90% right here, talking about the emissions and everything. It'll also talk about basically just recently we had the highest temperature ever recorded on Earth, different things like that. Now, the reason why I'm talking about that is because a lot of this is because of what they call carbon emissions and things like that. Well, you know what's interesting? Things that are supposedly up to said 50,000 years old, when they're dating it, they use basically the carbon dating. Now, the reason why I'm addressing that is because if you know about the flood, then you know that water shot out the earth, right? Now, why is that important? That water shot out the earth. It makes perfect sense because if you've seen, there was a paper that came out in National Geographic, and what they were talking about is that they realized a lot of the water or a lot of the carbon actually was absorbed into the earth. Now, that's no coincidence because what they also found out, I put a quote here, and this is what they basically found out. I'm just going to read the quote. It may be surprising that more than 90% of the planet's carbon is underground. So now think about that. If 90% of the planet's carbon is underground, right? And they'll tell you that what they'll try to tell you is that when they're measuring carbon, they think that carbon basically the only way we got carbon, they say it is created from stars and things like that. In fact, even on this, let me just show that real fast. On this, they'll talk about that right here. I'm just going to start from the beginning of the sentence right here, where it just talks about all of those atoms were once in the food we ate. Before that, in the air, oceans, rocks, and other forms of life. Watch what it says here. Carbon, an element said born of exploding stars. Now, is carbon only born of exploding stars, or is it possible that we can have carbon inside the earth? And remember, when the earth was created, the earth was very pure. It was in a pure stage. In fact, the earth didn't rain. It actually had a mist that came up and watered the earth. We had large creatures, large animals that could survive in that time. But it also continues and says it is essential for all forms of life. So carbon is needed for all forms of life. So why would we think that stars exploded before there was life when we seen that the biblical narrative addresses that before the stars were even created, he made plants, right? If we look at the Genesis model, right? Let's just take a look at it. The reason why I'm expressing that because I went over it before that the Genesis model makes more sense than the Big Bang model. It makes way more sense. If you go to the days of creation, and I expressed it scientifically how basically plants don't need the sunlight to survive. They need light. Plants don't need the sunlight to survive. They need light to survive. They actually need light to actually survive. Let me just go to one that expresses it okay. This one's all right. So remember in the beginning, God created light, right? From the darkness, that was darkness, and then he made light. That's what plants need to survive. And then from the waters, he separated the waters from the waters, right? Making different boundaries, making dry land, right? Because you need a place for the plants to grow. And then on day 3, he actually grew plants, all types of different plant life, right? And those can grow because the light was there. That's all they need for photosynthesis is that they just need light. And I went over that before that you don't actually need the heat or the sunlight. All you need is light to grow plants. So all of that makes sense. Then the next day, on the 4th day, he made the stars and all those things. So for people to conclude that the stars had to explode first before plants can survive, and that's how we got all this carbon, is actually incorrect. Rather, the carbon is even proven scientifically as it continues on. Carbon, you just say it came from stars, they'll say, right? It says it's essential for all forms of life. That's true. And so it may be surprising that more than 90% of the planet's carbon is underground. So how can we have that much if supposedly carbon came from, said, billions and billions of years from stars exploding, and all of a sudden this life ended up developing because all the carbon that's shot from the dead stars? How is it that most of the carbon is actually in the earth? What they'll try to say is it absorbs it. But what is important is that most of that carbon must have already been in the earth. And that's why 90% of that carbon is inside the earth. Now, why is that important? Let me just continue on. Remember, when the biblical narrative expresses what happened, it tells us this, right? We can read in scriptures like Genesis 7 and 12, and it says, basically in the 600 year of Noah's life, right? And remember how it's expressing that the world was different at that time. That's why people was able to live longer, because it expresses it didn't rain, right? Imagine how healthy the food is, right? They're in the presence of God, all these different things, right? In the second month, in the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were open. So the water inside, and it's actually, there's a study in nature that knows that that's actually how the carbon is actually moved, right? Deep carbon cycle contain, I'm gonna just go to something right here. I'm just gonna read the highlight. I'm gonna read a little highlight from this piece of nature. It just talks about two modes of basically talk about this carbon cycle and everything are associated with basically some things. I'm just gonna read the first one right here. The first is the basically, I'm just gonna make it make sense for the sake of understanding. It just talks about how the carbon is basically moved, right? It talks about the oceanic islands and minor seafloor settlements. Basically, that just talks about movements of the carbon, right? It just talks about, for example, one of the greatest sources for the carbon to move, just to make it simple, is fluids and magmas, right? Magmas, you think about volcanic action, right? How much time since our time has volcanoes shot out the earth, right? In fact, they talk about that nowadays we can't even, most likely for people to date stuff in our time frame, is gonna not be able to date it right. That's why if you see these little videos here, it'll talk about all that pretty much. The reason why is because World War I, World War II, they shot out a bunch of nuclear weapons, and they know that the nuclear weapons end up basically, long story short, making things unbalanced with the carbon emissions and things like that. And that for us to basically measure our time frame correctly, it won't be that accurate because of how much damage was done just from the nuclear tests and things like that. But we know that carbon can actually affect the whole world by different methods, right? Fluids. Imagine if the whole world had carbon inside of it and it shot out from the fluids that were in the earth and flooded and rained all on the earth. Also, magmas can went off. Different magma. We also got to understand, just because there was a flood doesn't mean that volcanoes didn't go off. We know volcanoes go off in the ocean all the time. So that's something that we also have to consider, how much effects were actually done just from the flood itself, right? And it'll talk about, it'll talk about these things can cause effects followed by its release to the atmosphere or oceans. So that's very important, that can change, right? Those CO2 emissions can change things. Those things can actually change things and cause things to be different. Now, there's other methods of dating stuff. Sometimes they use layers. Now, we who know the biblical narrative know that doesn't make sense, because we know that when the flood happened, there were layers that constantly moved from the settlement of water. That's why you got the fossil record. But sometimes when people are dating stuff, they'll see something like an isopod, or like said 6 million year old, like a 6 million year old jellyfish. And for example, the fossils that we have found of those humans were also mixed with those jellyfish, because in the Genesis story, humans were made on day 6 and animals were made on the same day. So and the fish were made just a day before. So if a flood happened and we got these rare extinct species found with these ancient humans, that means that the humans existed with those rare said extinct species. So that's what this video was concluding, is that it's also important to understand that the astronomical dates is also to be understood from the effects of the flood. That the effects of the flood they make perfect sense scientifically. That's just something is important, because the said out of Africa concept, one, it was eugenics. It was a racist form of eugenics, and that's a fact to science. They know that the out of Africa concept, when it came out, it didn't even have any evidence. Many geneticists actually talk about it. For example, I put right here from one of the geneticists, he'll talk about when it came out, right? I'm just going to read it, quote unquote. Before the 1980s, there was almost no discussion on the African origin of modern humans or modern people, right? The subject was rather basically marginal. there were two reasons why those discussions would not have been considered serious, right? And it just says, first, it was agreed upon that rather a remote ancestor of modern man was Homo erectus. Now, that's what that video was about, Homo erectus. That Homo erectus supposedly went missing about 8,000 years ago, or 800,000 years ago. He supposedly lived 1,000,000 years old and vanished 8,000 years ago. But a lot of people were trying to say that he was bound to Africa. That wasn't true, because they know that they found fossils of Homo erectus outside of Africa. But they knew that they said that humans were linked to this man called Homo erectus, supposed to be the origin of all men. But continuing on this, it says, which had appeared more than 1,000,000 years ago. They say probably in Africa. However, it has been known that it then spread all over Eurasia, right? Europe and Asia. Eurasia means Europe and Asia. So they knew that said species that was in Africa spread to the areas outside of Africa. Now, we also know that by the biblical narrative. If we focus on the biblical narrative, it tells us that about the time of Adam and Eve, they had two sons, right? One of his sons killed another son, and he was banished out of Eve. He had to go to the east. And then he spread all his lineage, and of spreading and spreading. There's no doubt that most likely that lineage went into Africa, right? So people before the flood could have went into Africa. Also, by the time of Noah, we also know that by the time of Noah had his 3 sons before he was 600 years old, right? And understand when I say this, I do believe these years because of the way the world was functioning. I do believe these years. Now, when Noah had his sons, we know that his sons were about 100 years old. Could his sons had kids at that time? Absolutely. Could Japheth had kids? Absolutely. It's possible that Japheth could have had kids in that time before the flood. There's no scripture that says Japheth never had kids before that time. So it's something that we also can understand. Even we seen when they got off the ark, Noah already cursed Canaan, right? How long has it been since they got off the ark for him to curse Canaan, right? And who was Canaan? Was Canaan actually Ham's actual blood son? Because it talks about that in scripture. It said because Ham was close to kin, he didn't curse him. So it's really interesting when you think of those things, because always remember, sometimes drama happens, right? Someone could have been with someone else, adultery could have happened, and someone could have had a baby by Cain, right? His wife could have had a baby by Cain. I'm not saying that that's what it is, but always consider these things, that there can be things of different mixing previous in that time. But before the flood, we don't know exactly what happened. We don't know who all was where, but we know that Ham, Shem, and Japheth had their own wives, right? We know that they had their own wives. That's just something to understand. The reason why I'm expressing that is because if those individuals were in the flood, remember how I was expressing how the carbon-14, which in itself only survives 6,000, not even 6,000 years. If you already know about carbon-14, you probably already know this, that it's known, right? Here's some information about carbon-14 and things like that. I'm just going to show you something real fast, right? It's already known about carbon-14 that the time it takes for carbon-14 to basically radioactively decay is described by its half-life. Carbon-14 decays with a half-life of 5,730 years. So remember, there's said dating stuff that carbon-14 is said to be used to date things up to 50,000 years. That's why this little note is right here, just to get a little more information deeper into those things. And it just talks about some of the information, right? The half-life of 14C or carbon-14 is approximately 5,700 years. Therefore, the 14C isotopic is only used for dating. See, it's only used for dating fossils up to 50,000 years. Now, if they can only use carbon-14, method that they say is more valid for dating stuff because they think the world always been in the same condition for only 50,000 years, how do they date things that are older than that? Well, they only date things older than that by using fossil layers or related history. Like, for example, they'll relate something that said supposedly that they find that they'll declare is an animal that's 100,000 years old or a million years old, something like that. And they'll say, if we find another creature like that, then it's said that same year. That's why those fossils that we found humans in the layers that they said are supposedly millions of years old with the same creature that's about that same age. So we know that that's not how you actually date things finite, right? There's no finite way to date things. They'll date it based upon the layers. For example, like some of the layers or some of the findings of Natufians and things like that, they declare that the layer that is found in must be the age of it. So remember, the flood caused flood layers. That's very important. The world didn't look like the same way that it looks now long ago. It didn't look like this long ago. But because of the flood and because of the carbon emissions that came out of the earth, because most of the carbon is in the earth that shot out of the earth, it caused a lot of things pre-flood to be extremely aged. And not just things that were pre-flood, but things that came out of the effects of the flood, right? Because remember, it still rained after that day. Where's all that carbon going to go? It's going to be basically circling around, constantly going down, so that even things that die, even said 4,000 years ago, can end up looking like it's 50,000 years old. So sometimes you'll have things like that carbon actually would increase the date or the year of those things. But to our benefit, we can actually express that the early humans actually didn't start in Africa because of that method, because of the same method. So the higher the year, the more closer to Adam. The higher the year, the more closer to the beginning. That's all that it means. But these years are not finite. The biblical narrative is actually the truth. And it makes perfect sense scientifically. It makes perfect sense scientifically when we understand the internals of the matter. So that was just something that's also important when looking at these things. I'm not declaring that the world is millions and billions of years, but rather I'm using the concept that they use that the world is millions and billions of years to defeat itself. You see what I'm saying? Like, for example, he says he uses the wisdom of the world to basically, show itself that it's foolish, that the world is foolish, because they try to say is this thing, but when you really look at it very closely, is actually requires a little more paying attention to things. So that's something that is important to understand. That's why we talked about these things that basically, the ice, like for example, when the flood happened, we got to also consider there was an ice age, right? If there was a flood and it went into cold areas, if it got cold and frozen, it would have looked like an ice age. As that ice melts, all that carbon is released, and even this nature study even talks about that. When it talks about the second, it says the second is the deeper carbon cycle that includes the subduction of carbon, right? Just talks about some things, and it says or melting of carbon bearing phases, right? Just talks about basically the movement of stuff in volcanic action and whatnot. All these things, just to make it make sense, all these things, all these methods are different ways of releasing carbon emissions into the air, right? The liquid from within the earth coming out, the volcanic action or the smoke from the carbon. If you've seen, there's already been studies that volcanoes, right, fresh volcano that comes out can be dated to say millions and millions of years, though they're newly formed. It's different things like that we know is a sure thing, is without a doubt. But that's why I put this here, to kind of get a little understanding on those things. Just if someone had a question on it, or if someone was curious on the method of process of these things, that the years that we see here, any year that's older than the other just means it's closer to Adam. That's all that it means, that it's closer to Adam. For example, let me just show something here. I went over this before. Sometimes I go over this, but let me show you something. For example, I'm gonna reveal to you a solid fact that a lot of people know, and that someone did a video on. I'm gonna let him basically explain it. In a layer that said 300 million years old, based upon its layering and based upon the findings of the creatures that's found in the Carboniferous. I probably said that weird. Carboniferous period. Probably said that weird, but it said a time frame where humans didn't exist, right? They say this is a time frame when humans didn't exist. But do you remember that in the biblical narrative, it said before the flood, people were working with metal and iron, right? They were working with different types of metals and irons in that time, different types of material. And remember, they said that they had some type of higher knowledge and things like that in that time frame. The reason why I'm saying that is because I want to show you something, because I have a lot of different things on this, but there's something specifically that I want to point out here. I just want to see if I find it real fast. This is something too. This is just talk about it's say a 500 million year footprint, because it stepped on an isopod. And remember, isopods are said to be in layers that were like up here, these higher layers up here. So that's why they say 500 million years. So it's like in between here and here. So they say isopod because a human stepped on one, right? So that could be evidence of someone pre-flood stepping on a creature that was existing in their time. But that's not what I want to show real fast. Let me go to a different one. I'm going to go to one of these, see if it's this one real fast. Yep. All right, so I'm going to show you something very interesting, right? A lot of these things are very real. You can find the evidence for them online or different places, but I'm going to show you something real fast on this. You're going to see something that was found in a layer that was said this old, right? And remember how they base the years. They base them because find them in those layers or different things like that. So I'm going to just let you see this real fast. I showed this before, but I'll show it again.
Too implausible to be true, and yet when they happen, we have to give them our full consideration. Take, for example, the discovery of a carved bell inside a seam of 300 million year old coal by a 10-year-old boy called Newton Anderson in 1944. The bell, which was found in Upshur County, West Virginia, is made of brass and came complete with an iron clapper. It was, however, firmly embedded in coal that formed during the Carboniferous period on Earth. To some fundamentalist Christians, this is evidence that the bell is a so-called antediluvian artifact created in the times before the biblical flood described in Genesis. Their assessment is backed up by the Institute for Creation Research, which had the bell examined at the University of Oklahoma. If they're to be believed, analysis of the bell revealed that it was made of a strange blend of metals that are inconsistent with any modern age design. For what it's worth, Newton Anderson took a polygraph test as an adult, the results of which suggest that he was telling the truth about the bell and the way it was found. I think we can safely assume that the Institute for Creation Research may be a little biased, but it's still a fascinating artifact.
Now, I don't know if you ever seen this before, but it's not hard to find. It just takes a little like understanding what it is. But if you see what this is, this was a thing that was found in a layer that was said, right? The layer that it said it real fast, but Carboniferous period. You can see right here, Carboniferous period. Probably saying that weird, but that's the time frame that this was found in.
That he was telling the truth about the bell and the way it was found. I think we can safely assume that with any modern age, their assessment is backed up by the Institute. Bell is a so-called antediluvian artifact created in the times before the biblical flood described in Genesis. Their assessment is backed up by a boy called Newton Anderson in 1944. The bell, which was found in Upshur County, West Virginia, is made of brass and came complete with an iron clapper. It was, however, firmly embedded in coal that formed during the Carboniferous period on Earth.
So you see what it said there? It said it was found in coal, found in this layer, a bell. Now remember how I said during the time of the flood, right? During the time of the flood, they worked with metals and iron, right? Before the flood, because when you think of the Iron Age and all those things, it's important to know, like, for example, we can type it down. Let's go to Genesis, and we can see it said ourselves that the biblical narrative speaks the truth, and that the world is the world that's looking more silly as we constantly go over. We find more and more fossils and more ancient finds. Right, that's something you can find out information on. Right, I'm just gonna go to one right here. Remember, these are going to be some sons or some individuals who are, if I believe, these are related to Cain. Yes, these are related to Cain. And it says, just talks about some things, basically just talk about what they did. They was playing with instruments and stuff. It says an instructor of every artifactor in brass and iron. And what was that thing made of? Remember what that thing we were just looking at was made of?
To some fundamental,
they say that this thing, this thing that was also tested,
Genesis.
This right here, this bell, a bell that was found in said this time frame. Let me see if I can just show you something, show it real fast. I'm gonna just grab it right here and just see if we can just find some more information on it. Let's see if I can find something on it. It shouldn't be too hard. Or let's see if we can type it down. Otherwise, I'll just add something to it. See, there it is. All right, you can see some information on it. I'll talk about this little bell here. Here's a little, I'll go to one of the pictures right here. You can see it right here, right? They talk about these little bells and stuff. This little bell here. So you can see different information concerning it. If you look closer, you can find different things on it. But it was a real find. It was a real find that they had found and whatnot. So there's a lot of different information on it. I'm not going to go through it right now, but they do talk about it, and they even talk about that time frame that's supposed to be a time frame where humans didn't exist, right? But we know, based on biblical information, is that the reason why you see all these things in fossils, which we don't even see in our time frame or any other time frame, we see things in fossils because of the flood. Because the flood, that's why we see things preserved in fossil layers. And that's how we can find layers. And they'll talk about themselves, right? Layers, right? Why are they in layers? Why are things in layers? Because of the flood, right? All these things being preserved in fossil layers, right? So you can see, if you ever wanted to, you can look into it. It's something that has a lot of information on it and whatnot. And talks about this little bell and whatnot. It's very real. It's a very real thing. And you can see in the biblical narrative, it'll tell you that before the flood, they were working with brass and iron, before that said Iron Age. So that's a long time ago when they were working the brass iron. Now, obviously, understanding the biblical narrative is the truth. That's what the truth is the biblical narrative, is that it's telling the truth. And we don't have to stretch the biblical narrative to try to make some other narrative or anything like that. All we have to do is let it speak for itself. All we have to do is let it speak for itself, and it'll tell us the truth. It'll tell us the truth of itself. And that's why I was showing it. There's lots of, when I say there's lots of other information I could show you of things found in said millions of years of layers, right? I got things that are said 600 million years old, things that are 500 million years old, 300 million years old, 100 million years old. And there are things that have involvement with human things, right? There's a lot of different things that are said to be millions of years old, but when you actually understand the scientific method, it destroys the scientific method. But if you look at the biblical method, then it makes sense. Then it makes sense, but other things don't make sense. So these are things that, when first seen, it may not make sense. And that's why we was going over this information, that it says, for example, today the planet is home to just one species of Hanadaman, Homo sapiens. So today, all other species of humans are wiped out. All other existence of sons of Cain, of sons of the Nephilim that came down, right? Whether people believe it's angels or not, that's another story, right? I believe it's angels. I believe they did come down, and things happened. And that's why the world was destroyed, because of the wickedness that kept growing. That's why it talked about great men being in that time, right? Giants and stuff. I believe even some of the information of giants that they may even call from different individuals are found in modern humans, that sometimes you find it autosomally, that you find this mysterious autosomal mix that's in people. That's why, and I believe that's why people kept growing and got bigger and start dying younger. But if you look carefully, that's a lot of information of tiny humans. Or right here, it just talks about there were giant humans, right? But a man called Dragon Man existed at a time when a number of basically different Hanadamans coexisted, right? Coexisted. That said, a lot of people, Neanderthals, Denisovans, different types of creatures, different types of people existed, including, Homo erectus, which we were talking about, that Homo erectus, a tall human with a brain 2/3 of the size of our own, as well as tiny Hanadamans, tiny humanoids, right? In South Africa and different places, Indonesia and the Philistines, right? That there were different size humanoids, right? That there's evidence of different size humanoids, and that this is something that's widely known, even in news, that there were different types of humanoids in different time frames, right? That's what I was talking about. That there were different types of humanoids, different tiny humans, big humans, and then we who came from Ham, Shem, and Japheth, from Noah, only exist today. We're the only all modern humans, which are said Homo sapiens, all modern humans exist today because we are the ones that survived the flood. That's what the scripture lets us know, that there was a species of people that exists today based on the biblical narrative of the flood. And we also see the evidence in genetics, is that we can actually have 3 different lineages that don't make each other, because remember, a Hamite doesn't make a Shemite, and a Japhanite doesn't make a Shemite, and a Hamite doesn't make a Japhanite. And we can see all those lineages with the AB, the CF, and the DE lineages, that we can see 3 different family lines that fill the whole earth. Based on the biblical narrative, it makes perfect sense. And that's why all these layers and all these different things, you'll see, different types of things that may, at first, when you look at it, may not make sense. But when you look carefully, you'll start seeing that it makes perfect sense based on the biblical narrative. You can see right here, 500 million year old fossil represents rare discovery of an ancient animal in North America, right? Different things like that. When they talk about creatures that said supposedly be that old, but the biblical narrative tells us that every creature was made by God, right, on the 5th day. So if we believe that humans were made on the 5th day, we also have to believe that animals were made on the 5th day, because none of those things exist prior to. So we have to understand those things and whatnot. That all these things make perfect sense when we take in consideration the flood, the carbon that came out, the way that they're dating them, which is based upon layers and not anything that's past the carbon dating ability. They start dating them with some weird methods, right? And that's why I was telling you about some of the things that were found with other things, right? So, and that's why we go about them very carefully. But we also have an understanding of something a little more deeper and controversial. And that deeper and controversial thing, if anyone has any questions, definitely ask. But let me close these real fast. So I just want to quickly talk about that. Why the years that we see is astronomical? Why are those years astronomical? Because they make perfect sense. They make perfect sense when we look at the big picture, that all these things make perfect sense. They just make perfect sense. But now I want to talk about something controversial. I want to talk about basically some information the reason why we're going over information of genetics, because I think truth is important, and that we see a lot of information that talks about the modern astronauts have a lot of mixing of different people. And I believe that the real people fulfill the scriptures where it says they have fallen by the edge of the sword and went into captivity to all nations. And it says that Jerusalem is trampled down by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles fulfilled. Now, the reason why I believe that's important, unbiasedly, is that a lot of geneticists are coming to the same understanding. For example, I talked about this geneticist here, but I want to just let it play and just talk about some things real fast. And if anyone, I'm just going to let it play so we can review it. And if anyone has any questions or any previous videos or any information, any question, it could be about biblical narrative, it could be about the scientific method, it could be about historical information, about all those things, right? So I have a lot of information. All I do is study so that we can show ourselves approved, so that we can understand these things. Not saying I'm the best in all things, but I say that we can look into all things and get a good understanding of those things by different professionals. So I just want to show something real fast on this. I'm going to go over this real fast.
So Indo-Europeans and Turks kind of emerged together. Eventually, the Turks rose and pushed out the Indo-Europeans, the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Ossetians, the Alans, all these groups, the Iranian-speaking peoples of Central Asia, like the Khwarezmians, the Masakians. But they didn't just exterminate.
So I'm gonna pause it real fast. The reason why I'm going over this because this was a study I was waiting for. This person on this little page, he ended up getting sick, getting cancer or something, but he ended up getting on some very deep, controversial things. I don't know what happened to him. I still feel like someone must have like did something to him. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if it happened naturally. I don't know if it happened because someone didn't like the information he was bringing out, but he was bringing out some deep stuff. I'm talking about deep genetic information, deep information. And then he was talking about, he was going to talk about the quasars. All of a sudden, when he started talking about the quasars, he got sick. And then he got cancer and all these things. But he pre-recorded his recording with his geneticist that we also talk about, that he said that E1B1 star leads to the Israelites. But he does make a claim here that some of the Ashkenazim had mixed with the Khazars. I talked about this many different times because I don't think that all the Ashkenazi are Khazars, but I think a large portion of them show that they are the mix of the Khazars. For example, what he says here, he'll let us know that the Khazars had a merging of certain Indo-European clans like the Scythians and things like that, and they basically became one. They all became one, but there's one group in particular that leads us to the original Turkish Khazars. But I'm let him finish what he's saying here.
They absorbed them.
So if you heard that, he said it right there. He said the Khazars absorbed them, like they absorbed a lot of the Indo-European groups. I'm gonna let it play real fast and pause.
The Sogdians, but they didn't just exterminate them; they absorbed them. And so the Khazars themselves were Turkic speaking. They had a Turkic identity, but they had within them ancestry from Sarmatians, Scythians, Sogdians, all these other groups. I'm only bringing this up. Well, I mean, not only, but I'm bringing this up because there is a connection between the Jews, supposedly Ashkenazi Jews, and the Khazars. This is not really mostly supported genetically because there's very little evidence of, say, East Asian admixture in Ashkenazi Jews.
But there's a little. There's a little. So this is what I would.
So now I just want to express this. Now this is one geneticist. I don't know how much studies he did into it or if he looked into it a lot, but there's one geneticist in particular that looked into it very, very much so. His name is Dr. Nathan Jensen, and he did a video about the Turks. Now, we can't just look at the Khazars and determine that, you know, they're just isolated people, but the Khazars are a branch of the Gog Turks, which the Gog Turks, they initially make the Ottoman Turks. They make the Seljuk Turks, which that's where the Ottoman Turks come from, and other Turks as well. But for example, I'm just going to show something what Nathan Jensen talks about.
This is a very intriguing geographic echo in the concentration of Group J in the Middle East and elsewhere today. The Ottoman Empire seems to explain the concentration today, and the history of the Turks seems to explain why we can have connections here and here, and the lack of a heavy Turkish presence in either of these places in recent history might explain why it's such a low concentration there. It fits the timing of the splits in these clusters, and here's how.
All right, so we believe anyone who has faith can be saved. We believe anyone who has faith in the Messiah can be saved, but we do believe something also in particular. Let me open up a note. We believe that, you know, truth can be found. We believe that that our God is not a God of confusion, that he illustrates things that make sense. Like he has an understanding that when he establishes things that are like established, like, for example, we know that he does miracles. We know that he can do things that are miracles, but we know that he's also a God that establishes boundaries and limitations on things. Like, for example, the world, we can understand, you know, the cycle of the moon and the sun and you know, the grass growing up all over the earth and things like that. We can understand those things. I also believe he puts the life in the blood, and that the reason why he also says in the Old Testament and in the New Testament not to eat the blood is because he puts the life in the order in the blood. For example, this is a map of the J group. There is a J that's over here that Dr. Nathan Jensen is talking about, and it's a group of J groups that became known as the Khazars, as the Gog Turks, as the Ottoman Turks, as the Seljuk Turks, and it's this J group right here. This one is actually going to be about the time frame of the said Israelites. So that's how we know this group isn't Israelites, because they're over here in Mongolia. It's going to be 1350 to 900 BC. Also, they continue on. They'll continue on for a long time over here. You can see some of them continuing on. But we also get them later on in the Turkish time. So you can even see this will be called a Turk right here. This will be a Turk lineage. This will be, 660 to 768 80. And what happens is, a lot of people don't know, but it's important to understand about the Turkification of the Middle East. For example, there's a group that grows over here. And when you start looking at history, you already may know, if you know about the Turks, that they grew in a group that was all the way back here. And they were basically in confederacies. They weren't all together, because over here you have Scythians and different groups. The Scythians, I had talked about that before, that they were groups with R lineages, R1s and R1As. And that's also what this little video I'm going to talk about talks about, that some of the Khazars had at R1A and things like that. That's like a said classic Indo-European lineage. But here it is. You're gonna see now a confederation right here in this time frame. You can see right here about 500. We're gonna get a major confederation called Gog Turks right here. That's when the Turks basically united. And when they united, before they split, they had a whole congregation called, or the group, a Kogan, called the Gog Turks, or GOK Turk. And they had a whole organization over here. Now, this organization, at this group right here, you're going to see it split, and this group is going to become the Khazars. But another group is going to come in through this way, and they're going to be called the Seljuk Turks. So you're going to see, as they divide and they split, you'll still have the congregations there. So you can see a part of the Gog Turks and a western part of the Gog Turks, so east part, western. But then you'll see shortly they will go into this area. So right here, it doesn't talk about the Seljuk Turks that much. Right here, actually, it does right here. So you can see here's the Seljuk Turks. So the Seljuk Turks are a group from them, and they end up going into here. And this is actually important, because when you think of the Middle East, not a lot of people know, but the Middle East is actually divided into different invading nations that came in from this area, that came in and settled in these areas. And that's where you get different groups. So you can see right here how much the Ottoman Turks and everything, they basically took over this whole area, even this center area. They end up circling this whole area, but they were fighting against the E1B1B Arabs. And that's also what Jensen talks about, that some of the Arabian lineages basically were fighting and holding their own against some of the Turks. And that's just some very deep history. Now, the reason why I'm showing that is because just going to continue on into some of the information that's provided here, and then address some of that, because it's very deep. It can be controversial at times, but it's very truthful. But let me close this and reopen it. All right. So again, so that others are not offended, as always, we believe that anyone who has the Messiah, no matter their haplogroup, whether they're Ham, Shem, or Japheth, are called to be saved, so that they can believe the way of the Messiah. But if we look at, for example, some of the mixing of Turkish people, we can get a good understanding of some of the mixes, right? We can see different groups. We can see R's. We can see some E's there. We can see some J's. We can see some I's, some L's, some T's, some all types of different lineages that mixed in, because they were a very mixed group. That's why sometimes you'll see the Turkish lineage match exactly, the haplogroups of the Turkish lineage will match exactly with the modern Jews, or the modern Ashkenazim that you'll see today, even what they would call nowadays, even the Sephardic, which are the same mix of these things. You can see the same lineages that will be there in these mixes. about the exact same. Iranian Turks, just the classic Turks, and the Ashkenazim. But let's continue on with this.
I believe that eventually genetics will validate the possibility that some few lineages of the Ashkenazim go back towards indigenous people absorbed in Eastern Europe, in what is today modern Russia, who probably descend from some Khazar Jews. Okay, I do think that that's probably true. It's a very small number, but it's not nobody. Okay, I think there are going to be a small number. The Khazars themselves were religiously diverse. Some of them remained shamanist worshippers of Tengri. Others were Muslim, and others were Orthodox Christian. And then, of course, some were Jewish. What I've read is that there is a supposition that the royal house of the Khazars adopted Judaism, partly to distinguish themselves from their neighbors, the Christians to the west, the Muslims to the south. And so it was a good way to kind of, compromise and stay neutral. And we see this later in history with pagan Lithuania, where they were apparently pagan for a really long time because they didn't want to pick Orthodoxy or Catholicism. They wanted to kind of hold out. So they had negotiating positions. So the Khazars were doing this with Judaism, I think. And so they were one of the great Turkic confederacies, right? And Kievan Rus crushed them in a series of battles, and eventually they disappear from history. But the Khazars are just one chapter in a longer story. Earlier stories, the Go-Turks, the first Turkish Empire, which comes like all the way from basically Romania to Mongolia. It prefigures the Mongol Empire, and then later the Mongols themselves were highly Turkified in the Golden Horde. So the Russians were under the yoke of the Tatars, the Tatar yoke. So the victory of Kievan Rus was a temporary affair in a way when you think of it historically, when it came to the steppe versus the settled, the farmers versus the nomad. So the Khazars ultimately lost their battle against the various peoples who they fought. Because they fought the Arabs, they won. They allied with the Byzantines, and they were dominant for 2 to 3 centuries. But then the Russians, under the Rurikids, crushed them. Okay, so these are led by Varangians, Scandinavians, who assimilated into the Slavic population. But eventually, they themselves were overwhelmed by the Mongols, who were led by many Kipchak Turks. So the Khazars are just part of, I think, a bigger story here. But an interesting part with the Judaism.
Before ending this episode, I'd like to ask 2 follow-up questions. And that is, we've discussed what modern DNA studies has told us about the Khazars. And so now I'd like to ask, what were some of the traditional viewpoints as to who they were, especially in older historiography?
I think the older historiography kind of knew they were Turks, but really what they said was they were heathens. So the Judaism of the Khazars is actually kind of late, I think, as they became more and more intertwined with, the quote civilized world. So the key with the Khazars is they, like the Huns and the Avars, they're an Eastern Asiatic people that are not Christian, that come onto the edge of the civilized world on the backs of horses in Hutt. They are the 9th century who wrote a counter narrative of how alien, as like uncivilized, as almost subhuman, right? Ancestry about 30 to 40% Southwest European, and then the rest is Northern European.
Focusing on just the Judeo aspect of the Khazars?
Insofar as, there's a whole group of anti-Semites who want to disconnect modern Jews from ancient Hebrews by saying they're Khazar converts. That's obviously false. Modern Jews are about 40 to 50% Middle Eastern and Ashkenazi Jews, 40 to 50% Middle Eastern ancestry, about 30 to 40% Southwest European, and then the rest is Northern European, 10 to 20.
So this is where Ken is weak at. The reason why is because he doesn't know about Dr. Nathan Jeanson's study. We'll talk about that too. It's important to understand not all of them are the same grouping. Not all of them are the same haplogroup. But majority of them are going to be from different nations, not from the homeland of the Levant. The people that are, some of the Ashkenazi groups are from the Levant. That's going to be the E groups, because inside their group, they have this E-M35 and E-M34. And if we follow that lineage has been in the Levant the longest. It remains, it becomes the Arabian lineages. It's a lineage that is found in the Levant. There are other lineages that almost every one of these lineages is contested to be basically migrants into those areas. The earliest lineage that meets the E is the R groups and the T groups. The T groups and the R groups are both in the Levant before the J groups. The J groups come down. They start in the Caucasus. They go up to Finland about 6,000, 5,000 years. They're there for a long time, BC, 6 to 5,000 years BC. And then later on, they go to Mongolia, become the Turks. And then some come down into the Levant, settle in Sidon as the Sea peoples. That's something that's also important to understand, that they do go into the Levant. And that's why a lot of times people know them as Levantin, but we got to be careful how we go about that, because it's known that that Levantin group are the Sea peoples, because they actually are proto Greeks. This group right here is actually Proto-Greeks. You can easily look it up. Proto-Greeks, the J group. And the R group, these are the Scythian groups. I already went over it, how I explained how we found basically ancient Scythians, some of the rulers of Scythians, the ones in the basically the burials of the high-ranking Scythians, that they end up also coming into the Levant by the invasion of the Sea peoples, because the Sea people is actually a confederacy of multiple different groups. But the leaders of the Scythians, the Kurgans, that are found in like kind of like domes, like the Egyptians also built domes to bed in. That's what pyramids, a lot of those things were, with like their little pyramid thing. But the Kurgans had little domes, little hills that they had. And some of the groups that we found there had the R lineages, right? And they were Scythians. They were different Scythians that also had mixed in with some of the Turks. But we also have to look at the things, very carefully when looking at these things. So there's different mixes, is what I'm saying. There's different groups, different mixes. But the E lineage, that's the Levantin lineage. There's like 30-40% of that in them, sometimes 20%, depending on the groupings that you find. That's the one that's going to be of the Levantin lineage. The T group also meets with the T group also meets with the E group. The T group, a lot of times, some individuals, like the one from the show, Nathan Jensen, some think they are Jews, but they're not technically Jews, because they actually become some of the Vandals, and they're also found in a culture way too early to be Jews, which is called the Gasulian culture. It's not hard to find. It's just Gasulian, right? A lot of people know about the Natufian culture. Not a lot of people know about the Gasulian culture. The Natufian culture later becomes the Gasulian culture. And you'll find the E groups there, and then a new group that's introduced there, the T group. The T group will be introduced into that population of that group. I don't know if this one has any mention of the genetics, but I do have some papers with that. They basically are E and T groups, long story short. I'm not going to look for it on here, but I'm going to close it. But this is the culture in the Levant. This would be the Levant area. You can see the Dead Sea and everything, and the Jordan right here. The Sea of Galilee. It's called the Gasulian culture. That's by the Dead Sea and Jordan and everything. So it's a very ancient culture that's found there. It's right after the Natufian time frame, but they do have T's and they do have E groups there. They're older in the Levant before the J groups gets there. But then the J group comes into that Levantin area. The J and the I groups are highly related. The J and the I groups are highly related. If we have papers that talks about Khazars are I, this little video is going to talk about the Khazars are R1A and G. Dr. Nathan Jensen knows that the Khazars are J. So I, J, G, and R1A are known as being Khazars. But continue just to show where he addresses that on here.
20%, somewhere in that range. So they're not Khazars. Like I said, they have like a little bit. There's some evidence of some East Asian ancestry in some groups, and where does that come from? We don't necessarily know. I think it could be Khazars. As far as the Khazars themselves, there's a lot more about them than their Judaism. But we want to interpret in a modern lens in a way that's relevant to us. And as your viewers know, the steppe is kind of ignored. It's just not a compelling narrative for most people. It's a source of barbarism, scourge of God, terror and destruction. I mean, that's
couldn't be here today.
Narrator of many of
YouTube channel and
Nick Barksdale, and today
I am a history buff and a history nerd, but I also happen to things, and most of them you can find right now at my Substack.
Describing a group Khazar
Confederacy, they dominated the region between the Dnieper and the Volga for several centuries, up until
I just want to point out on this thing
their confederacy.
where he
They
talks about the
battled
haplogroup.
Arabs multiple times. They allied with Byzantium in the seventh, let's say eighth.
I'm just gonna.
And they were Turkic. They were physically quite distinct. They were described by the Byzantines as you would describe Turks, kind of like flat-featured, swarthy skinned, dark-haired. So they look Turkish, we know that, and we have some DNA from modern Turks and some ancient Turks. What's associated with the Turks is often haplogroup Q, which is common among many Altaic Siberian people.
So Q as well?
But another thing associated with the Turks is R1A. That's often R1AZ93.
So okay, just for clarity, that's what he addresses. He says, you can see right here, if we look in this group of the Ashkenazim, sometimes you'll see that Q. So you can see right there, you'll have a Q right there, the Q, and you'll also get that R1A. So right here, this would be R1A, R-M198. That's actually R1A. So Q and R1A, he would say that those would be the Turkish haplogroups. Also, there's Jensen's information that goes a little more into it.
How, just to make it clearer, why? Why would there be a Turkish connection to Europe in the 700s? Because I said there's some clusters here that separate in the 700s. Well, recall from previous episodes that there's a steady stream of Central Asian peoples into Europe from the 500s, 700s, and one of the 700s peoples is a Turkish group. The Oghuz peoples moving from Central Asia into Europe are Turkish peoples. But not the only Turkish peoples. There are Turkish people who stuck around Central Asia and became then part of the Turkish armies that came into India. These are not the only Turkish people. There was a split between whoever these people were and the Seljuk Turks in the thousands. So that would explain the 1100 split as they go this way. And these are the Seljuk Turks go this way. And these two groups are separated by the arrival of the Mongols. And those who persist in modern day geographic Turkey expand after the arrival and throw off the Mongol yoke and have this empire that persists in the Middle East up until the modern time. So let's watch this history again with one map to make it even clearer, because the Turkish peoples, in my view, are the best explanation at present for this group J, not Arab Muslims. So these peoples, even though I think Turkish peoples is here. Yet history, their origin is not there. It's in Central Asia in the 600s. Turkish people arise in Central Asia in the 600s. Some of these people begin migrating to Europe in the 700s, which is why I think we see some of the echo and the splits between Europeans and Indian peoples at that point in time. There's another split that happens, the Seljuk Turks, which give rise then to the modern Turkish peoples around the thousands. But there's still Turkish peoples left over. The split happens in the thousands, and those who are still left over move down then and are invading, part of the armies that invade India in the 1200s. I mentioned the last episode talking about the Vikings, that there's this general rule of thumb that seems to emerge in the human family tree, that last empire standing wins. Yes, you might invade and take over, but if there's some people group that comes in after you and then wipes you out, they're the group that's going to be dominant today. So, yes, they arrive in Europe in the 700s, but there's many other peoples who arrive after them. So they're a minority of European peoples today. The peoples in India, we saw that the Delhi Sultanate is followed by the Mughal Empire, the Mongols. And so they're not the last empire standing. They're a minority of India today. Even the Seljuk Turks, as they pass through the Middle East, are not the last empire standing. The Mongols march through here, and after the Mongols, other Iranian peoples who then rise. And so they're not the major grouping in this part of the world today, not even in the Middle East, because the Turkish people here are followed by the Mongol conquest. So the Turks are pushed into modern day geographic Turkey as a result of the Mongol conquest, but then they begin reconquering again and become the last empire standing in other parts of the world. They move into Europe, but eventually pushed back out. They move into parts of North Africa, And perhaps more importantly for our study, they're in the Middle East for several centuries, right up until the modern era, when the modern Muslim countries, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, emerge today. This history of the Turks seems to find a very strong echo in the geographic extent of Group J today. So who are the Jews? Who are modern day Jewish people? Well, it seems that the section, I should say, a subsection of modern Jews, along with many other Middle Eastern peoples, and some Europeans, like Greeks and other Balkan Peninsula folks, and Italians, and even some Spaniards at a low percentage, and even some Indians, all share a common Turkish heritage. They trace some of their origins to Central Asia.
All right, so just for the sake of understanding, that's why we go over this information, because a lot of geneticists are coming to this understanding. I also found these things to be true when going over these things on bias, right? And remember, I had already addressed what I am. I'm R1B M269. You can see it even on this chart, R1B M269. Now, that's why I go about these things unbiasedly, because we want to know truth. We don't want to know a biased narrative. We want to know truth. So yes, a large portion, if we break this down now, if we break it down based on multiple studies, right? I can show you another study from this individual, the study of the Armenian people, right? The DNA and origins of people, the Armenians. They know that every Y chromosome that's found in Armenians is also found in Ashkenazim, but they also know that I2, I haplogroup is the Khazars. Now, we just got multiple different Y chromosomes that we can get an understanding of what they are. We can understand what most of these Y chromosomes are. I'm just going to summarize it really quickly, right? And remember, like I said, I'm not saying that these Y chromosomes are redeemed. That's not what I'm saying, right? As I've been expressing this, I've been expressing it for the sake of truth, not for the sake of confusion and for debating and arguments, but for the sake of truth. What I'm concluding is that the groupings that are said to be the modern Jews, right? I'm concluding that the J groups are actually Indo-European, native to the Greeks, some to the Turks, some that came from Finland and different areas, that those are actually going to be out groups, not the actual ancient Jewish groups. I'm also concluding that the E group, the E1B1B, has close ties to Arabian, that original Arabian, the original Levantan. That's why it's not fair to call all the Ashkenazim Khazars. It's not fair to call them all one thing, because they're a mix of things. They're actually a mix of things. So this is going to be the ancient Arabian group. The R1B M269, that's going to be the Indo-European lineage. But remember, we talked about that. It came from the areas of Asia. It went down into Africa and it swooped around to Spain and went up and became your modern Indo-Europeans that are in Britain. This is what they call bell beakers, or basically the lineages of modern Europeans, like the British, things like that. They end up going into Africa, out of Africa. So technically, almost every person with our lineage who's R1B is actually technically descendants from Africans, because they actually are a group that first, before you get them in Europe with a more lighter skin tone, they actually go into Africa and come out of Africa. They go into Africa. They don't start in Africa. They go into Africa. I talked about that before in another video. And also you get your R1A that didn't go into Africa. R1A is different than R1B in that matter, that they didn't go into Africa. R1A mostly circles around area of Scythians, and they mix with other groups like the Khazars and things like that. That's what the guy was talking about, R1A. There's also, we talked about G group. The G group is one that settled more in the Caucasus. Some of them went into Africa. That's just a group that sometimes you see also mingled in. And then there's your Q group, which is more known to be like the Khazars or far lineages of the Mongols. In fact, this is a Mongol lineage. It's known because I can show you a video from was it Kings and Generals, where they do a whole video on the genetics of Mongols. I'll just point out real fast. Let me see if we can find it. real fast from Kings and Generals. They just did a real deep video on it. Right here is Genghis Khan, the ancestor of millions. And just on this little video, I'm not gonna play it or anything, but it talks about basically when they did a genetic test that the Q group was actually the group that basically was the Mongol Empire based, and that's also a lineage that went over to America too. So this Q group was one of the lineages that actually became the Mongol lineage. That's what it's called. It's called Genghis Khan, ancestor of millions. From Kings and Generals. From Kings and Generals, they did a little video on that. So you can see some of the mixes there in these groups. You can see some of the mixes, and then we talked about T group. That's the one that actually the E group brought into them. The E group is the original Arabian lineage, but they end up bringing some of the T group into them, and you'll see them in the Gasulian area where they would work with metals and stuff. And remember, the Jews didn't have metal; they wasn't working with metal. But this is a different culture. The E group is the ancient Arabian lineage, and the T group is a group that ended up growing in the Arabian lineage. And remember, I talked about that Armenian study that also said that M2 was also a lineage of the Khazars. So how many lineages that are close connected to the Turks? You got one lineage here. You got another lineage. You got J. You got R1A. You got Q. You got I. So you got a large portion, maybe about 50% of them are related to the Khazars or far Turkish lineages. And then you got your ancient E's as the Arabian lineage, or the lineage that settled in the Levant. A lot of it moved into Africa. We know that because if you listen to the biblical narrative, even historical documents, it'll tell you that Jotanites went into Arabia. They went down into Ethiopia. You can get, obviously, the biblical narrative that is a historical document of the Israelites and the Arabians a little bit. That talks about, even by the time of Joseph, we see that the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, or the Midianites, the ones of Keturah from Abraham, from the woman of Abraham, we know that they go into Africa because they sell Joseph to the Egyptians and they end up settling in Africa. We also get historical reports that say they ruled in the areas of Africa. Then you get, other mixes and things like that, the other R's and stuff like that. But that's why we went over this, because I think it's very interesting to look at the full picture of what we're seeing in the groupings today, that we're actually seeing a mingled company, and their whole story has a history to it. All these genetics have a historical story to them, and all of it makes sense, right? We don't have no mysterious Y chromosome that we can't relate to Ham, Shem, and Japheth, but we can actually even make these monophylactic, like J, R, G, Q, T, I are all one. Not E. E is related with DE. DE is a lineage that's split in the north. In fact, I wanted to share something. I just wanted to show something that I had a conversation with Hebrew of Israel, individual that is looking at a lot of this information and things. And he gave me a really interesting sheet that I think makes a big point that a lot of people don't know. When they look at the E group, they say they're confined to Africa, but that's not actually true. Ancient E's actually ruled in the Levant and upper areas and coasts. They did go into Africa later, but a lot of the E and D groups, the yellow that you see here, are D groups, right? The D is known as being Japanese. You can see right here, about 7,000 years ago. But remember how I talked about that, how these astronomical years are because of the flood, that a lot of that carbon and the ice melting into the atmosphere caused a lot of these years to seem extraordinarily stretched. So you can see right here, here's another D. You can see 2,800 years before present. There's another D group. There's another D group right here, kind of hidden behind this one. Let me just zoom in. Remember, D and E split. So they split in the Middle East, because I have a paper that also says that they split in the Middle East. I can bring it out if I need to. 1,000 years before present, 900 years before present. So that's something that's also important to note and see, because I actually believe that D groups are close related to Elam, that they would have probably been over here and split from here. And these groups that you see over here, these are E1B1B, right? And a lot of these are ancient lineages. You can see right here, 4,000 years before present, 3,000. These are, everything that you see here is E and D groups. So you can see a lot of them in the north, right? Long time ago in the north. So you can see all the way over here and stuff. These are ancient E and D groups that spread all the way in these areas. So you can see a lot of these lineages over here. This one's even E1B1A. This one's E1B1A. That's all the way over here in France. That's actually really interesting. Just to note that's really interesting. So very, very interesting stuff that you're seeing here. So very interesting, because I have a paper that talks about that's E1B1A up there. These are the real Shemitic lineages that would have been in these areas and spread out throughout these areas. So of course they went into Africa, like I was talking about the other E groups that went into Africa, and then they dominated Africa because remember I talked about that, how some of them went down into Yemen and went down into these areas and dominated these areas. Some even went down the trail of the Nile. But you can notice that the E groups end up spreading in these areas over here, right? So this is a very, very deep paper. On my other video, I got a thing where it says DE, or talks about these things, and you'll see it at the bottom of the note. So you'll see it right there at the bottom of the note, and you'll see all these things. So very deep stuff, very interesting. I thought the most interesting thing about that was that E1B1A that I found in France, right over here. So I thought that was very interesting. Find that E1B1A said 5,000 years ago. That's before the Mota. That's before Mota gets into Africa. That's before, because there's a lineage that said 4,000 years ago of a E1B1A that goes into this area of Ethiopia. This is probably it right there, Mota Cave. That's EM329. That said 4,000 years before present. And that's an E1B1A. That's actually E1B1A2. That's E1B1A2, or in a sense called E1B1AC. But this right here is going to be your E1B1A that actually settled up here. So that's actually very important. Yes, that's an E1B1A. And you can see the real papers, the real reports on these things. This is actually a real interesting find. So this is just something to consider, that, when you think of who are ancient Israelites, we got to be careful not to take a racist narrative and say that, E groups must have always been in Africa, because the Outer Africa concept is true. The Outer Africa concept is false. And these are fossils that contest of it, right? Even reaching all the way over here. Because that's why, remember I was talking about the Turkish lineage, end up also having some E groups with it. Some of those E groups are light skinned. They can, some people who are pale skinned right now might even be an E group and not even know it. They might even be an E group, right? That's just something that's just true. It's just a true thing. You never know what you are. If you never got a genetic test, you don't know who you are. But you know that if you belong to Christ, you belong to Christ, right? You know that you belong to Christ. But if someone wants to understand the life of the blood, if you're mixed, if you're Ham, Shem, or Japheth, or things like that, you can get a good understanding by looking in the life of the blood and get an understanding of who you are, right? If we first look at the Ashkenazim people, we may not know who they exactly are. And it wouldn't be fair to conclude that they're only one thing. But it would be fair if we look into the things closely, right? And that's why I'm saying that E group is the one that's actually more ancient in the Levant. There's more of an ancient lineage that had went into the Levanten area. And that's going to be the one that settled over here. You can see some in these different areas and whatnot. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. There are ancient lineages that were in the Levant. Some you find as Natufians and different groups that I have mentioned before. Just get a little closer zoom here. And it's just deep information. Here's this probably the Gasulians and stuff like that. Yeah, pre-pottery Neolithic B. That's when the T group gets introduced in this group. The T group introduced itself into this group, which is called the Gasulians, in the area of Jordan. So this is just some information of some different groups from different areas. So you can see from different areas and different lineages that mixed in certain areas and whatnot. Long time ago, very, very, very ancient lineages and everything. Very, very ancient. This is going to be the original Levanten lineage all the way to his root. So that's what makes it really interesting, that this lineage was over here for a long time. Very, very long time. But the J group, that's one that actually, like I was talking about, that's one that it started in the Caucasus and it went to Finland and stayed there for like long time before it even went down. But this is going to be more of the lineage that I don't think gets a lot of attention. But if you look closely at it, you can find some very interesting and ancient information. So that's what I was talking about. There's that E-M35. E-M35, that's also found in Ashkenazim. That's what we were showing, that E-N35 that was found in Ashkenazim. But there's a brother lineage that is your E1B1A. That is a northern lineage. It was in the north before it was in Africa, right? So very, 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 very interesting stuff. So with that, family, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, that's just what I wanted to go over is give a little information for these things. And I'll just post some of these in the description. Let me actually reopen that. But I wanted to give the chance for just a live, just focusing, because sometimes when I go live, I don't have a lot of time to look at questions, because sometimes I'll be flying through the information and the stuff. Because what I'm doing is basically source grabbing and sharing the sources of stuff. So that's all I'm gonna do is just share these sources with you for the sake of truth, for the sake of edification of truth. But with that, family, if no other questions, if you see any of the videos, you have any questions, if you put a timestamp and you put a question, I'll answer that question like I'm live. If you ever have a question on something, just timestamp it as a question and I'll look at that. But other than that, that's all I got for you. With that, be blessed, be beloved, and amen.